Ora si registrerà la conferenza.
Perché con la webcam che dicono che ci si fa online.
Come sempre i problemi tecnologici si affacciano puntualmente ad ogni incontro. Dunque noi siamo ad una, direi, prelibata anticipazione delle due culture che si apre domani. Sapete che domani apriamo il nostro 14° meeting sulle due culture. E oggi abbiamo come anticipazione questo colloquio su un tema che più due culture di così non potrebbe essere, il tema sull'enigma della coscienza, tra filosofia, biologia e medicina, che è il tema per eccellenza, anche in qualche modo uno dei temi che più travaglia, starei per dire, la coscienza che travaglia se stessa nella ricerca e nel tentativo di comprensione della sua stessa essenza. Abbiamo questa sera il piacere di questo colloquio a 4. Interverranno la professoressa Angela Ales Bello dell'Università Statale di Milano, no? Della? Lateranense di Roma. Il professore Jean-Pierre Changeux, che già ci ha dato l'onore 7 anni fa di essere con noi, e noi lo ringraziamo per questo ritorno, la professoressa Kathinka Evers dell'Università di Uppsala e il professore Marcello Massimini dell'Università di Milano, che è un medico. Quindi abbiamo un medico, un biologo, due filosofi. Coordinerà questo colloquio Michele Farisco, che è interno a Biogem. Noi dobbiamo ringraziarlo per averci offerto questa occasione, perché lui ha invitato questi 4 illustri personaggi ed ha, come dire, organizzato l'incontro. Lo dico per i pochi che non lo sapessero: Michele Farisco è un interno di Biogem, è entrato qui un po' di anni fa, il tempo vola, una decina di anni fa circa. Come studente noi allora avevamo un master in biogiuridica e lui venne come uno degli studenti, e però si distinse subito. Insomma è rimasto, voi sapete che insomma, è molto attivo sul versante filosofico, è presente nella unità del Brain, che ha come unità specifica per la parte filosofica l'Università di Uppsala, e poi qui in Biogem abbiamo realizzato una unità di ricerca che si chiama Scienza e Società, che ci consente di fare quello che noi abbiamo sempre detto di voler fare, di non volerci cioè chiudere nella specificità della nostra, diciamo, ricerca biomedica soltanto, ma abbiamo inteso aprirci anche al mondo esterno, quindi alla società e tutto ciò che questa apertura comporta. Io mi fermo qui, ringraziando i 4 relatori, ringraziando Michele Farisco e ringraziando tutti voi che avrete la pazienza e io mi auguro il piacere di ascoltare questo importante colloquio su un tema assolutamente centrale che parla appunto alla coscienza di tutti voi. Buon ascolto.
Grazie Presidente Zecchino. È veramente un onore per me questa opportunità e ringrazio di cuore i relatori, soprattutto chi è venuto da molto lontano, dall'estero, per onorarci della propria presenza. Dirò soltanto 2 parole, poi ognuno dei relatori farà una propria introduzione e quindi ci sarà uno scambio o tra i relatori o comunque con chi voglia appunto intervenire. Quindi dicevo, è per me un grande onore questa opportunità per diversi motivi. Anzitutto dal punto di vista scientifico la coscienza è tra i temi più dibattuti sia nella ricerca di tipo prettamente scientifico ma anche nella ricerca umanistica, in primis quella filosofica ma non solo. Oggi c'è molta ricerca sul tema della coscienza, ma manca ancora quella che potrebbe essere detta una teoria finale. Non abbiamo la soluzione all'enigma, appunto, della coscienza. Poi c'è anche il motivo culturale per cui sono davvero onorato di questa opportunità. Qui a Biogem abbiamo a cuore le 2 culture e quale tema più della coscienza sintetizza l'incontro tra la cultura scientifica e quella umanistica. E poi mi permetterete di evidenziare anche un motivo autobiografico per cui sono onorato di questa opportunità. La coscienza è il tema della mia ricerca filosofica degli ultimi 10 anni. Perché quindi parlare della coscienza oggi? In effetti chiarire il perché noi siamo consapevoli di noi stessi e perché ci rapportiamo agli altri in modo consapevole è alla base della nostra responsabilità, possiamo dire, politica, sociale, morale. Quindi la coscienza è un tema chiave da questo punto di vista, è ciò che ci qualifica come soggetti, appunto, ripeto, sia politici, sociali, morali. Tuttavia è un tema centrale, ma raramente se ne parla in modo approfondito. Eppure noi siamo stati anche chiamati a intervenire su questioni, per esempio con la legge 40, non so quanti di voi la ricorderanno, in cui il tema della coscienza in qualche modo entrava pure, no? Per l'inizio vita. Ci sono poi le tematiche del fine vita, dove la coscienza pure entra a gamba tesa. Per cui è importante chiarire di che cosa parliamo. Ed è importante parlarne con esperti. Oggi abbiamo qui 4 autorevoli esponenti della filosofia, come si diceva, della neurobiologia e della medicina. I problemi intorno alla coscienza sono tanti, io mi ero raccontato altre cose, ma vado subito ad introdurre il primo relatore, che è la professoressa Angela Ales Bello, che è una esperta della filosofia della fenomenologia, che è una grande tradizione filosofica. In particolare si rifà a Husserl e ha approfondito la professoressa le voci femminili del cosiddetto circolo di Kathinka, in particolare Edith Stein. La professoressa quindi ci presenterà un'analisi del tema dell'enigma della coscienza in rapporto alla scuola fenomenologica. Quindi prego la professoressa di accomodarsi. Grazie.
Ringrazio molto per questo invito. Io parlerò in italiano, la nostra dottoressa traduttrice farò ancora una sintesi, dico questo perché così la preparo. L'enigma della coscienza è appunto uno dei temi fondamentali della scuola fenomenologica in particolare. Questa scuola, come sappiamo, è iniziata nella Germania della fine dell'Ottocento e primi del Novecento, e il fondatore è appunto il filosofo Husserl. La fenomenologia significa appunto analisi, riflessione sui fenomeni. E per portare a termine questo progetto di analizzare i fenomeni, cioè tutto ciò che ci viene incontro, ed anche noi stessi che veniamo incontro a noi stessi, è necessario, secondo Husserl, che aveva una formazione matematica e quindi è anche molto utile la sua posizione perché conosce, se non altro, la scienza matematica, ma poi conosceva tutte le altre scienze. Per analizzare i fenomeni, dicevo, è necessario un metodo. E qui possiamo notare è molto vicino all'altro matematico che è appunto Cartesio, il quale ha parlato anche di metodo. Il metodo husserliano consta di tre momenti fondamentali. Il primo momento è la sospensione del giudizio rispetto a tutte le nostre conoscenze precedenti. Questo non significa che queste conoscenze devono essere eliminate, ma dobbiamo fare uno sforzo per poter iniziare da capo la ricerca. Questo d'altra parte è un elemento fondamentale per la filosofia. La filosofia è nata proprio con un atteggiamento critico, come sappiamo, ma è necessario anche poi una costruzione, quindi non si può rimanere in un atteggiamento puramente critico. E per costruire due momenti sono anche qui fondamentali. Una prima constatazione, che noi esseri umani siamo capaci di cogliere il senso delle cose, certamente non di tutte le cose, altrimenti avremo una conoscenza senza fine, diciamo, ma siamo capaci di cogliere alcuni momenti fondamentali di senso. E in particolare, questo è il terzo momento appunto, e in particolare siamo capaci di cogliere il senso di ciò che noi viviamo. Quindi i primi fenomeni che incontriamo sono i fenomeni relativi alle nostre esperienze vissute. Queste esperienze vissute ci accomunano nella loro struttura. Per esempio, tutti comprendiamo che cosa significa gioia se conosciamo la parola gioia, ma possiamo fare la traduzione della parola gioia e quindi sapere cosa è la gioia. E appunto questo terzo momento è fondamentale perché è iniziando da noi stessi, dai fenomeni che noi viviamo, che noi possiamo conoscere noi stessi e conoscere il mondo circostante. Quindi non è un'analisi filosofica che parte in astratto, anzi al contrario, parte dalla nostra esperienza vissuta. Questa esperienza vissuta comincia dalla corporeità. E io mi vorrei fermare sul tema del corpo in questa occasione, perché ritengo che sia importante proprio per gli studi che si conducono in questo contesto e per vedere qual è il punto di vista dei nostri fenomenologi sulla questione della corporeità. Certamente non è un punto di vista scientifico così come noi siamo abituati a considerare, cioè non riguarda le scienze, noi vedremo la fisiologia per esempio o altri tipi di scienze, ma riguarda la conoscenza che noi abbiamo immediata e profonda della nostra corporeità. Questa conoscenza inizia dalla percezione, che è una percezione non soltanto delle cose esterne, ma anche una percezione di noi stessi. E noi stessi siamo paradossalmente soggetti e oggetti della riflessione. E a iniziare proprio dal nostro corpo. Il nostro corpo quindi è definito come un corpo vivente. La cosa interessante è che esistono molti oggetti fisici che ci circondano. Questi oggetti fisici non sono viventi, potrebbero essere degli animali, in questo caso sarebbero certamente viventi, ma la vita che noi sperimentiamo ha una sua caratteristica peculiare. Per cui il nostro corpo è accompagnato da una profonda vitalità che ha un versante psichico. Quindi noi non possiamo parlare soltanto di corpo, noi parliamo di una corporeità legata alla psichicità, e il termine che viene usato dai nostri fenomenologi è il termine life, e significa appunto corpo vivente. È un corpo vivente. Questo corpo vivente perché è diverso dagli altri corpi, eventualmente anche viventi, per esempio? Perché è un punto zero di orientamento. In questo momento noi non possiamo uscire da noi stessi per metterci da un altro punto di vista. Immaginativamente lo possiamo fare, ma in realtà siamo legati. E siamo legati alla nostra corporeità. Però questo non significa che siamo chiusi nella nostra corporeità. Anzi, il nostro corpo è un corpo in continuo movimento, in continuo sviluppo. Ed è interessante anche l'esperienza attraverso la quale noi vogliamo i confini, i limiti della nostra corporeità. Questa esperienza è l'esperienza tattile. L'esperienza tattile ci fa conoscere i limiti della corporeità. Certamente non solo la visione è molto importante, la vista è importante, ma la vista ci fa soltanto una parte della nostra corporeità. La nostra corporeità è conosciuta attraverso l'esperienza profonda della tattilità. Quando dico esperienza profonda della tattilità, vuol dire che noi di questa esperienza abbiamo coscienza. Cosa vuol dire coscienza? Perché qui il punto fondamentale. Vuol dire che le nostre esperienze vissute sono accompagnate dalla consapevolezza, quindi sono accompagnate dalla coscienza. Nella nostra lingua italiana noi abbiamo un solo termine per indicare la coscienza nel senso della consapevolezza e la coscienza nel senso della coscienza morale. Noi sappiamo invece che nella lingua inglese o tedesca, in questo caso ci interessa la lingua tedesca, esistono due modi per dire coscienza: Bewusstsein, cioè la coscienza che è la consapevolezza che ci accompagna, e Gewiss, che è la consapevolezza, invece è la coscienza in senso morale. E allora della nostra corporeità noi abbiamo immediatamente coscienza. Coscienza non vuol dire sempre coscienza riflessa, ci sono due livelli di coscienza. Una coscienza che accompagna le esperienze anche in questo momento e la riflessione che stiamo facendo su queste esperienze. Questa ulteriore riflessione è una coscienza di secondo grado ed è quella che ci conduce anche all'alta coscienza. Se noi ci fermiamo, come stiamo facendo in questo momento, ad analizzare ad esempio la nostra corporeità, ci rendiamo conto che abbiamo coscienza della nostra corporeità. Facciamo dei passi e questi passi sono legati sempre a movimenti che sono accompagnati da consapevolezza, altrimenti noi capiamo, riusciamo a proseguire. Ma la riflessione che stiamo facendo adesso è una riflessione di secondo grado. Perché è importante la costituzione del corpo? Perché il corpo, come dicevo, è legato alla dimensione della psiche, quindi ha una sensibilità certamente connessa con le sensazioni di cui abbiamo coscienza, ma è legata alla dimensione della psiche, cioè le reazioni che noi immediatamente mettiamo in atto quando abbiamo una conoscenza di noi stessi, ma soprattutto degli oggetti fisici. Quando noi conosciamo gli oggetti fisici, subito abbiamo una reazione che può essere positiva o negativa. In questo caso è liscio questo che io sto toccando, e fino a qui sono io, poi c'è qualcosa che non sono io. Ho esperienza della mia corporalità e contemporaneamente ho esperienza dell'oggetto esterno che sto toccando e che mi dà un senso di grande piacevolezza. Però non c'è soltanto questo, non c'è soltanto il legame psicofisico, perché noi possiamo mettere in atto altre esperienze vissute, sono le nostre potenzialità anteriori, e sono appunto le esperienze vissute che riguardano una sfera che secondo i fenomenologi è una sfera specificamente umana, che loro chiamano Geist. Geist in tedesco vuol dire spirito. Spirito vuol dire ciò che è specificamente umano, che non appartiene ad esempio al mondo animale, al mondo vegetale, al mondo delle cose. Quali sono queste esperienze? Il fatto che noi possiamo valutare. Io posso valutare se in questo momento continuo a parlare. Questa è una valutazione che è legata alla mia libertà, o forse anche a delle spinte psichiche, certamente, è sempre una spinte psichiche. Ma questa valutazione non può essere confusa con una reazione psichica, non può essere confusa con una reazione tattile, percettiva, nel senso tattile, appunto, ma ha una sua specificità. È una vivenza, io traduco così la parola tedesca è legnis, ho tradotto con una parola spagnola, portoghese, perché mi sembra che sia più efficace, cioè rende meglio il senso. Noi in italiano diciamo vissuti, ma vissuti non ha senso, perché vissuto è ciò che noi abbiamo vissuto, ciò che noi stiamo vivendo. E ciò che noi stiamo vivendo è una vivenza. Allora, la vivenza della valutazione è importantissima, e poi c'è la vivenza della decisione. Se io valuto, poi decido se fare una cosa o non fare. Allora, c'è una stratificazione profonda nell'essere umano, una complessità che nasce dalle esperienze vissute. In che senso? Pensano i fenomenologi che non possa essere negata, nel senso che noi stiamo facendo esperienza di queste esperienze. Noi dobbiamo ammettere che ci sia questa dimensione, ci siano queste tre dimensioni. Inoltre, se noi torniamo un attimo alla nostra corporalità, la corporalità è qui, questo mi sembra un elemento molto interessante, animata appunto, come vediamo, dalla dimensione psichica, è un organismo. Insistono molto sul concetto non di un attimo, certamente. E il concetto di organismo è un concetto molto piccolo, che vuol dire che c'è un movimento interno, una messa in forma interna. Il termine forma che è interessante. Questa messa in forma interna che consente agli organismi, in questo caso anche agli animali, non soltanto agli organismi umani, di svilupparsi attraverso delle modalità che tendono ad una finalità, tendono al telos di perfezionamento dell'organismo stesso. È chiaro che poi c'è il tema delle malattie, delle difficoltà. Che cosa sono le malattie e le difficoltà? Sono gli impedimenti di questo sviluppo intellettuale, se vogliamo usare la parola greca, intellettuale, che tende verso il telos. Cioè questo elemento della messa in forma interiore i fenomenologi insistono sul fatto che il corpo soma, cioè non è solo soma. E cosa vuol dire che non è solo soma? Perché ci sono altre dimensioni. Come si possono definire queste altre dimensioni che non sono somatiche? Il problema è, lo dico subito, che secondo i fenomenologi non nascono dalla corporeità, sono diverse dalla corporeità, hanno anche una loro diversa origine ed è quello che tradizionalmente poi viene chiamata anima, certamente, ma la prova, diciamo, di questo sta nella qualità di queste esperienze, nella qualità di queste esperienze. E un secondo, brevemente, un argomento che vorrei indicare, perché non possiamo fare in tempo, è che accanto al termine coscienza non dobbiamo dimenticare che c'è il termine inconscio. Finora abbiamo parlato della coscienza in senso positivo, ma noi non conosciamo tutto quello che profondamente sperimentiamo. Finora ci sono diverse modalità di parlare di inconscio. Una modalità è quella secondo la quale, questa è un'esperienza che noi facciamo in un momento, fruire delle nostre esperienze interiori. Prima parlavamo di una cosa, adesso parliamo di un'altra, e poi vedremo un'altra. Questo fruire prevede un'ora, in questo momento sto dicendo, e anche una sedimentazione di quello che ho precedentemente detto e che non è più presente, però c'è. E una tensione verso il futuro, cioè quello che si dirà successivamente. Allora, ciò che è sedimentato non è immediatamente davanti alla coscienza. Ho bisogno del ricordo per avere di fronte a me stessa. E quindi la sedimentazione richiede poi un risveglio, un tirare fuori nel caso del ricordo, ma può essere anche interpretata in maniera più ampia, cioè come rapporto tra la veglia e il sonno, sedimentazione, inconscio vuol dire non coscienza come quando siamo seduti, e poi la veglia. E poi un altro grande tema derivato la nascita. Cosa c'era prima della nascita? Cosa ci sarà dopo la morte? Zone di confine che prevedono l'inconscio. E ancora, dico brevemente, una sfera passiva delle affezioni sensibili. Per dire che questo oggetto è così, io ho bisogno di dire che è diverso da questo, diverso, lo sto isolando. Questo movimento di isolamento non è conscio, non è conscio, è passivo. È un altro modo di dire inconscio. Ma c'è un terzo modo di dire inconscio che ci lega poi alla psicologia, alla psicanalisi in una forma più forte, perché esiste nella nostra psiche una dimensione impulsiva prima, c'è un impulso di cui non siamo coscienti, che forse possiamo portare poi alla coscienza. E qui c'è appunto tutta la discussione dei nostri fenomenologi, in particolare di Husserl e anche di Einstein, con la psicologia del profondo indiano e con la psicanalisi freudiana.
Ringraziamo la professoressa Ales Bello che ci ha dato uno spaccato di quello che è un approccio, possiamo dire, non riduzionista alla coscienza, perché uno dei problemi centrali è se la coscienza, per dirla filosoficamente, è un fondamentale, cioè ha una sorta di esistenza autonoma, oppure è derivata, deriva, si collega per esempio al cervello. E quindi adesso diamo una voce appunto alle neuroscienze. Jean-Pierre Changeux non ha bisogno di presentazioni. Nel frattempo poi io pregherei il tecnico di caricare la presentazione, così siamo pronti. Dicevo, Jean-Pierre Changeux non ha bisogno di presentazioni, praticamente è impossibile sintetizzare il suo apporto alla scienza nell'ultimo possiamo dire più di mezzo secolo. Lui è in questo momento professore onorario presso il Collège de France e il Pasteur di Parigi, ma svolge attività di ricerca anche negli Stati Uniti, in California, presso il Cambly Institute for Brain and Mind. Ha ricevuto svariati premi internazionali per le sue attività di ricerca, tra cui il premio della Olaf Thorne Foundation, l'Albert Einstein World Award of Science e il Goldman Package Prize. Ripeto, questo è solo una minima parte di ciò che lui appunto ha fatto e ricevuto. La sua lezione ha come titolo The Connectomics of Conscious Processing from the Molecular to the Cultural Level. E quindi Changeux descriverà l'evoluzione della coscienza in rapporto a diversi livelli del cervello, da quello molecolare a quello appunto culturale. Prego quindi il professor Changeux di accomodarsi.
Thank you very much, Michele, and I'm not going to disappoint you, since perhaps many of the facets we heard about in Finland, you will not be dealt with extensively, but at least I will try to illustrate that at some stage, in particular in the second part, the architecture of conscious processing, maybe some of the aspects which were mentioned could be taken into consideration. So, nothing is happening. Well, I need a mouse. Okay. Okay. So thank you very much. I may start by the issue of evolution of the human brain and talk about the paradox of brain humanization. So we have to forget about the notion that the spirit or the mind or whatever came in at one stage of human evolution, but it is a progressive evolution. And you can see here from Australopithecus that there is, up to Homo sapiens, a very dramatic increase of the size of the brain, which is not only a change in the weight or volume of the brain, but also the connectivity. And this is interesting anatomical evolution. And you can realize that this took place in less than 2 million years. And in fact, if you see here the evolution from Homo erectus to Homo sapiens is simply 1 million years. So it's a very short period of time. And during this time, the human brain developed cognitive abilities distinct from those of non-human ancestors, including language, self-awareness, so-called consciousness, theory of mind, and also creativity and cultural evolution. So all this is taking place in a very short period of time at the time scale of evolution. And you can even see that before Homo sapiens, there was Homo erectus and Neanderthalensis, which is quite different using this way of drawing the scale from Homo sapiens. So there is not only a change of volume, but a change of connectivity. So that's the reason why I introduced in my talk the title, connectivity, which means that it's not only the side, but the organization, to clearly use a word that was mentioned before. Now the paradox is here. If you look at the number of genes in mice or chimps, you find that there is almost exactly the same, perhaps a little bit less genes in humans than in mice. So this is an interesting genetic paradox. And in addition, when you look at the sequence of brain protein compared to testes, liver, or skeletal muscle, you find that the brain proteins are the most conserved. So there are really very few genetic differences. The same number of genes and a very stability of brain protein compared to those of male testes. So this is, of course, something that we have to deal with. And together with Gulas and Silgetag, who are two German colleagues, we propose this Connectomic Hypothesis, which means that, in fact, we are not looking at structural genes, as I said, they evolve very little, but regulatory genes or regulatory sequences, and that there are indeed a few change in regulation of gene expression in the past few million years, which led to substantial changes in brain connectomic architecture. So there is some kind of non-linear evolution between the evolution of the genome and the evolution of the cognitive abilities, and most of all, the connectomic of the brain. And therefore, there is, again, a non-linear relationship between the two. And this means that, in fact, we should have a look to the evolution not only of the size of the brain, but of the architecture of the brain, to try to understand, in particular, and this is the theme of the topic today, the emergence of conscious processing. Now, I have to go back to some definitions, sorry for that, but we may first distinguish lowest level, what I may call the states of vigilance, wakefulness, sleep, dreams. And this is not the only level I am going to distinguish, but several more levels may have to be taken into consideration. And they are hierarchically nested and developed successively after birth. So consciousness is not going to fall down in the human brain in one step, on the opposite. And the second aspect I wish to mention is the capacity for global integration, and in particular of the body, which was mentioned before, of the sensory cognitive memory function. And this global integration mean the subjective experience of the subject in front of some external processes or external phenomena. Now there is another aspect which was mentioned in the previous talk, which is the issue of self-consciousness. And not only self-consciousness, but the phenomenologists forgot about it, the self-other distinction. And I think this is something which came out after Husserl and all these philosophers, which is for us a very important aspect of the human brain, is the ability to have social interaction, and in particular to clearly evaluate in our conscious processing the relationship between the self and the other. And this is in particular being expressed by the issue of the theory of mind, which is the ability of human beings to represent the state of consciousness of other people. And this is an interesting stage. And I wish to say that the first two stages are coming up early on at birth, or a few months after birth. But the self and self-other distinction are developing progressively, and the theory of mind is around 4 years of life, and the acquisition of culture is itself mixed from the beginning to until now. So there is also an additional aspect which I like to mention, which is from another philosopher I like especially, Spinoza, and which is present in most of the living organisms, as was discussed before, but which is very strongly developed in the kind of human, which is a drive to survive. And I wish to say that this is a dimension which is developed in the human species, and which include, of course, what may be called intentionality, the way to anticipate what's going to happen and try to evaluate not only for the self, but also for the others. So all these hierarchical levels are nested and progressively developed in biological evolution and postnatal development. Now the situation is simplified. What I say is a rather simple minded. It might be, of course, more complex. Now I'm going to stay today mostly on the first two levels, and at the end I may start to go to 3 and 4, but for the time being, let's stay at level 1 and 2. And then I will distinguish two aspects of this first two stage in particular, to be conscious of the outside world, conscious awareness, and there are distinguish two aspects which, to simplify, I will call, as far as the connectomic architecture is concerned, vertical architectures and horizontal architectures. And the vertical architectures are very classically illustrated by the work of Penfield and Jaspers and others, and for the regulation of the state of wakefulness and sleep, which is under the control of norepinephrine, glutamate, acetylcholine, through the pontine ascending reticular activating system. Now, this has been further elaborated by Linas and Paré at the level of the cerebral cortex itself and the connection with the thalamus. So there is a thalamocortical loop, which is under the control of this pontine ascending reticular activating system. And you can see clearly the outcome here from Lina's work, where you can have the state of awareness, which is to be awake, then the slow wave sleep, and the REM sleep, so I don't know, which in all these cases, and maybe Marcello will discuss this aspect, the complexity of the signal change with the states of consciousness. And I contrasted these vertical architectures, which what I may call horizontal architectures, which are involved in another aspect of conscious processing, which is the content of consciousness. So we had the states of consciousness, and now we have the content of consciousness. And here I may mention the first work of Bernard Bass, of a global workspace for data sharing and broadcasting, as opposed to non-conscious processing by a separate kind of architecture that we could call processors. So there is a global physical space, but Bass did not mention any plausible architecture of conscious processing and kept the Jasper vertical organization to account for that, which is not the case for us. And the proposal is that, in fact, we could have some kind of horizontal architectures which connect different parts of the brain, and in particular the cerebellum, if I may say, which is not being omitted here, as you can see, where the long-range connection are able to interconnect different areas of the brain and give rise to a global kind of relationship between these different parts of the brain. And there would be physical, because these axons with long-range connection are indeed known since harmonic Arad, beginning of the 20th century. And if you look at these work from Patricia Goldman-Rakish, you also find in the monkey that there are a big network between the fronto-parieto-temporal cingulate cortex and cerebellum, now I am adding, which is involved in the processing of the content of the consciousness. So this actually can be more visualized by this kind of scheme, where you can see that here for visual processing, you have the posterior visual areas which are activated. And then when the image becomes conscious, then there is a global ignition. That's the word we discussed together, Stanislas Dehaene, and the fact that we have here a mobilization of the global neural workspace in conscious processing, and in non-conscious processing, a much more limited mobilization. So this was proposed with Stanislas Dehaene, Michel Kerzberg, and myself in 1996. So more than 20 years ago. And still this scheme is still used, but of course it's extremely simplified again, but it's better than nothing. Now, the ignition process has been further examined in detail, and you have here the ignition process for, let's say, visual image, which starts the ignition when the signal is reaching the prefrontal cortex. Here you are from V1, V2, V4, and then the prefrontal cortex, and you see that when the signal reaches the prefrontal cortex, there is this ignition taking place, which can be visualized by this scheme. So this is interesting because it may be a connection with what I am going to talk about tomorrow, which is art. And here you can see a very interesting experiment by Kringelbach, who is a Danish scientist, and he looked at the effects of a face, which is let's say, normal, and infant, and a cleft picture. And the interesting here is that you found a difference in the ignition between the two. So we may see that there is some kind of aesthetic ignition, which is a step further in the ignition process, which link together several ignition of individual parts of the picture. So this is, if you wish, the minimal architecture of conscious processing. I just saw a picture from Wang, not published, but he made in bioarchive, deposited. And just to show you how it may look like, this is a simulation again of the ignition process. So this is just to illustrate how this global neuronal workspace can be viewed as accounting for the access to consciousness and account for the content of consciousness when it becomes conscious versus non-conscious. So, of course, from the evolutionary point of view, it means that we have to deal with additional level of organization of the cerebral cortex, which are increasingly becoming more and more full of long-range connectivity. And you may look at the mouse, very few level, the macaque, a few more, and humans. I'm sorry for that. Many levels, and therefore we think that there is a differential increase, not only of the surface of the cerebral cortex, but of the long-range connectivity, which creates, for instance, the most interesting aspect of working memory, which is that if you remember how many units of representation we can get in our brains stored, it's 7 plus or minus 2, while in the monkey, it's no more than 2. So it means that there is a dramatic difference in the evolution of the content of consciousness, but also in parallel of the long-range connectivity of the body. So there is also another very interesting aspect, which I am not going to discuss extensively, that going from rat to human, or from even monkey to human, you can see that there is a shift of layers. And this is of importance, because the upper layers give horizontal, mostly connection, and the lower layer, mostly vertical connection. So you have vertical connection here in the monkey, which shift in human to upper layers. And this means that you have, by this shift, an increase of the long-range connectivity, which is taking place from the monkey to brain. Now, there is to close a few additional elements to take into consideration, which is the postnatal epigenesis and the cultural evolution. Now, the human brain, as I said, is increasing weight considerably after birth. So there are several processes which are taking place. I mentioned the theory of mind, among others. And this is due to the fact that there are several waves of synapse being formed, and which are nested one with the other. And how does this nesting take place? Well, the idea is that you may have some kind of Darwinian process, of course non-genetic. It's some kind of neural Darwinism. Edelman following us has used. And here you can see a stage where there is a maximal diversity and then selection. And during postnatal development, there is not only a genetic influence which is taking place to specify the level of conscious processing, as I discussed, but also the way this processing is being adapted to the outside world through, for instance, the exposure of the developing infant to the outside world, and in particular to the family and the society in general. So, of course, you have to get the idea that there are many of these steps put together, which gives some dramatic increase of some of the features. And one of them, I will just mention briefly, is the postnatal selection of cultural circuits using the example of writing and reading. And as you know, this is a recent discovery, which has about 8,000 or 9,000 years. And during this critical historical period, human beings have invented this way of writing some concepts, which I mentioned the first talk, as words or sounds being, of course, linked to some image. And the interesting observation which was made by Desjardins in French neurologist in 1900 was that some lesion of the white matter of the connective organization of the cerebral cortex, as you can see here, give the loss of reading without the loss of writing. So not only you are able to have separate circuits which are involved in reading and writing, but you can even separate reading from writing. And there are images which illustrate this point. And in fact, the brain and consciousness of the illiterate compared to the literate, to some extent, are different. In particular, when an illiterate is exposed to writings and he does not form in his conscious space the words that a literate person is able to do. So this was first found by Martin Ingvar in Sweden, together with a Portuguese group by Caso-Cadas, and recently further expanded by Stanislas Dehaene and colleagues. So there is at this stage something new, very new, which around 2 years of age, first of all, there is access to the diversity of language between Chinese, English, and German, for instance, as you can see here. This may be due to some epigenetic process taking place during the expansion of the arborization of pyramidal cell dendrites, and then around 4 to 5, the acquisition of reading and writing, as I illustrated before. So I will close here by summarizing the Connectomic Hypothesis, an extended period of brain ontogenetic development, then a scale-up multi-level organization of the brain, which the expansion of the long-range connectivity with the shift of reafference I mentioned, and then most of all, an extended period of postnatal development where the qualities, if I may say, of conscious experience is changing quite a bit. So, and in particular, the acquisition of language recursivity. So this is under the control of a few genes. I put in red, still very debated. So I will close on a slide which is less optimistic than what I showed before. I showed, of course, an increase of brain size. I showed an expansion of the brain. and in particular an evolution of the cortex with extraordinary expansion, which is taking place in the course of evolution. Now there is even what I may call a disproportionate expansion of the association areas like the prefrontal cortex and the other one. And last but not least, if you compare to subcortical areas, clearly you see that there is a disharmony between the growth of the neocortex and that of the subcortical areas. So I will close on a pessimistic note, which is from Günther Anders, and there are, of course, many other authors who have mentioned this aspect. What he called the Promethean gap between our faculties of manufacture, of create tools, and our imagination, and the incapacity of our imagination to grasp the enormity of what we can produce and set in motion in our brain, including the atomic bomb. So I will close on this pessimistic note without mentioning, of course, another aspect which is today's experience without the atomic bomb, but that in Ukraine, where clearly there is some thinking which is disconnected with the perception of human life and death. So something has to be done at the world scale, of course. And this is to acknowledge the participants of this work, in particular Sani Sandehan, Lucy Goldtag, and Pani Kukuli, and Marina Picciotto. And I wish to thank you for all that. And this is the last picture of FIFA.
Ringraziamo il professore Changeux che ci ha sintetizzato un'enormità di dati, sia dalla neurobiologia ma anche dalla genetica, e ha anche manifestato una grande apertura all'ambito filosofico. Non l'ho detto, ma Jean-Pierre è un grande conoscitore anche di filosofia, tra le altre cose, ed è il creatore di una delle teorie neuroscientifiche più importanti, che è la Global Neuronal Workspace. Quindi la scienza rivela tantissimi dati, hanno identificato con estrema chiarezza quali aree del cervello sono coinvolte in quali processi cognitivi, in quali processi appunto di coscienza. Però rimangono delle domande fondamentali, se cioè le nostre esperienze coscienti siano del tutto spiegabili con queste attivazioni di tipo elettrochimico. Ed entra in campo quindi la filosofia. Adesso sono davvero emozionato perché do la parola a Kathinka Evers, che è la filosofa che più mi ha, come dire, anche posso dire formato nella mia esperienza filosofica. Kathinka è professoressa a Uppsala, in Svezia, professore onorario anche in Cile, e ha avuto esperienze di insegnamento in vari paesi del mondo, tra cui Inghilterra, Australia, Cina, Sudafrica, Argentina. Sin dal 2013 dirige quella che è l'unità di filosofia e neuroetica dello Human Brain Project, e oggi analizzerà quelli che sono i presupposti del dialogo tra biologia, filosofia e medicina sul tema della coscienza, perché il dialogo tra le diverse discipline è, come abbiamo intuito, probabilmente assolutamente necessario. So please, Kathinka, the floor is yours.
Ok.
Sì. Grazie. Well, first of all, I would like to thank the organizers very warmly for having invited me to this meeting. It's a great pleasure to be here and also to visit this wonderful part of Italy that I've never visited before. So thank you for that. Now, the previous two speakers have focused quite a lot on rather rational considerations. And I will differ in perhaps focusing more on irrationality, in line with the last quote by Jean-Pierre Changeux and the Conectomic Architecture. Now, a dialogue between biology, philosophy, and medicine, of course, presupposes mutual understanding and respect. And that actualizes the questions of the interrelations between these domains. And here we may focus either on sociological perspectives, such as the cultures of science that may differ between them, or on more profound theoretical perspectives. Now, philosophy distinguishes very obviously but fundamentally between facts, theories, concepts, and norms or values. Perhaps somewhat less obvious, but equally fundamental, is that these three dimensions are not merely complementary, but they can be symbiotic. Notably, theories of consciousness, as they have de facto developed, they are both empirical, theoretical, but also deeply normative. My key message in this brief presentation is going to be that very strong normativity has permeated our theories of mind and consciousness, and that has had deeply negative consequences, both scientifically, because it has blocked the scientific development, and socially, because it has blocked progression. And I think that in order to understand this, understand consciousness, we need to understand this irrationality that has been throughout the development of this science. Now, empirical observations and theoretical conceptual analysis, they are of course complementary. Theory without practice is empty, but practice without theory is blind. But they can be far more than that, because there can be game changers across the two realms. For example, empirical observations can necessitate a deep revision of old familiar concepts or even the creation of new concepts, and vice versa. Observations do not come naked like a tabula rasa. They are always interpreted, and the interpretation is perforce theory. So this conceptual analysis of the interpretation of data can lead to a deep reinterpretation of the observations. So in this sense, the relation is far deeper than complementarity. Now, the scientific revolutions and philosophical revolutions in physics, they illustrate this very well. Since the philosophical revolution, the Enlightenment, with roots in the 17th century, when Newton published and established classical mechanics, the revolutions in physics and philosophy have superseded each other, driven notably by Einstein's theories of special and general relativity, Bohr's quantum theory, Heisenberg's indeterminacy principle, and quantum mechanics. Now, new ideas in physics very often open up new avenues of research in areas such as mathematics, philosophy, and logic. For example, the concepts of relativity and indeterminacy were introduced in philosophy as well, and even into the previously paradigmatic determinate realm of logic. Now, the situation is starkly different from the development of the mind sciences that have been dominated by a deep theoretical inspiration. For example, in the 20th century, philosophy was not at all interested in philosophy of mind, so was not interested in brain science or in indeed any natural science that had to do with consciousness. They didn't find it relevant. They were focusing on a priori argumentation. Vice versa, in neuroscience or psychology, insofar as they even don't think about consciousness at all, they drop away. They were not particularly interested in philosophical reasoning, but focused almost exclusively on empirical research. In my view, this is one major reason why there has not been a single scientific revolution in the sciences of mind or research on consciousness, in spite of the incredibly marvelous and impressive scientific developments that Jean-Pierre Changeux has been presenting in his last talk, that have been revolutionary in one sense because they really have been, but not in the sense as it is. It's not that they have completely reason, time, space, reality, and so on. There is a huge difference. And I think that the separation between science and philosophy has been too pronounced. That is one reason. Another reason lies in the very deep normativity that has been knitted our views on consciousness and mental features and mind through history. Now, all science are normatively laden. That includes physics. But there are big degrees and differences between them in that regard. And in order to properly address the questions such as what consciousness is, who and what we may justifiably ascribe consciousness or other mental features to, and in what sense and on what level. In order to do this, the normativity of the distinct discourses must be brought. I do believe that in physics, for example, there is a certain normativity. But I think in the life sciences, there is more. So if you have waves of emotions and evaluations in physics, you have tsunamis in the life sciences. And we need to understand the differences. Theories and norms, scientific and philosophical theories of mind need to be considered also in a wider normative perspective because ideology and psychology partly determine scientific choices and drive developments in science. And in addition to philosophical and theoretical scientific relevance, conceptual and theoretical choices also have a deep moral, political, social, and existential significance. Human societies and their intellectuals operating within them have worked very hard to establish a variety of mental hierarchies. And in the establishment of these mental hierarchies, there are different issues and different implications at play. One concerns the old religious idea of having or lacking a soul. In the Christian tradition, as a rule, animals did not have souls at all. This was reserved for humans. In other religions, you have different views, but here I'm speaking about the Christian. Another scientific question was the having or lacking consciousness or sentience, by which I mean the capacity for subjective experiences or the capacity for experiencing emotions. Now you can conceive these questions as an either-or situations, rather like a light bulb that is switched on and off. But that would not be realistic. It is far more complicated. The nature of mental features are very diversely distributed among different individuals, different species, different people, and also the diversity of the ethical implications drawn. Now, as I said, at least in the Christian cultures, animals are at the bottom of the scale. They are not considered any soul, they are not considered any sentience or any ethical relevance. But what about humans? Are they all on the top? No, they are certainly not. Humans are placed in these mental hierarchies on very, very different scales, depending on their ethnicity, race, their gender, and on their social class. Importantly, the question we should raise is not merely whether consciousness or some other mental feature is there or not. The most important question is how it is there. Now, science has played a key role in establishing human mind scales permeated with ideologies, and it is certainly very difficult to assess either the presence or the qualities of the mind of another if the culture in which you live and the sciences that are a product of this culture dictate rejection. I will take as illustration how science has been deeply misogynistic. Ideologically driven science has for centuries attempted to prove the inferiority of female minds, female consciousness, female cognition. They were very much inspired by Darwin, who wrote in The Descent of Man that the adult female is the intermediate between the child and the man. The chief distinction in the intellectual powers of the two sexes is shown by man attaining to a higher eminence in whatever it takes up than women can attain, whether requiring deep thought, reason, or imagination, or merely the use of the senses and hands. Thus, man has ultimately become superior to woman. Swedish philosophers, biologists, and professionals in medicine were very inspired by Darwin. They collaborated passionately to try to prove the inferiority of the female brain. The female brain, they argued, well into the 20th century, was too weak to withstand higher education. She would develop mental disorders. She could not cope. Still worse, her ovaries would shrink and make her infertile. So female higher education, Sweden was conceived to be a threat to the maintenance of the family and indeed the human species. There is not a shred of scientific evidence, not one thread. And these so-called theories dominated science for centuries. Similar stories were told about ethnicities. Our indigenous population, the Samis in Sweden, Jews, the Romas, non-whites, blacks, all over, social classes, a very typical English tradition. The illustration can be varied. Now, I'm not saying that normativity is a problem in itself. I think normativity and having values can be a very important inspirational source and driving force. But it is a very serious problem when unscientific ideologies are allowed to permeate and drive what is presented as and conceived as public and scientific theories. And this is certainly something that has deeply hampered the development of the mind sciences, in addition to reducing, sociologically speaking, vast portions of humanity to a life in mental prisons and servitude. Now, fortunately, the situation in the mind sciences, neuroscience, psychology, philosophy of mind today has improved considerably. Racial hierarchies are no longer in vogue, and the previously so passionately misogynistic science trying to prove the inferiority of female minds had also lost most of their momentum. And to quote Jean-Pierre Changeux from his wonderful book, Physiology of Truth, the search for the neurobiological basis of consciousness and rationality offers an unprecedented opportunity to properly value the simplicity of her personal experience, the richness of cultural diversity, and the variety of our ideas about the world. The circle has expanded not only beyond humans, but even beyond mammals, based on observation of behavior, experimental measurements, and theoretical analysis. For example, the octopods have been found to possess a mental life and an intelligence of rare interest and beauty. There is another wonderful book by Godfrey Smith called Other Minds that describes this. However, the discussion continues to be both normatively and theoretically confused. Because, for example, the octopod, which is vastly more intelligent and sentient than the mouse, has no protection in laboratory setting because it doesn't have a backbone, even though animal rights are normally conceived to be a result of acknowledged intelligence and sentience. And suddenly the backbone takes on very, very strong dimensions. So we're always sort of backlagging here in our discussion. And when we ask how far the circle has expanded, we see even more confusion, both normative and theoretical. A growing number of scientists and philosophers are talking now about artificial awareness or artificial consciousness. And the European Commission recently carried out what called a new proposal to investigate precisely that. And Dr. Michele Farisco will lead the philosophy analysis in one of those proposals that received funding with my collaboration. And it is indeed a very interesting issue to see how even panpsychism has recurred. There is a resurgence of panpsychism, both in science and philosophy. Panpsychism being the idea that the material reality is inherently conscious, that there is non-zero consciousness in everything that exists. But it seems to me that the idea of artificial awareness, this development has gone very quickly. People have become very enthusiastic very fast. And I wonder, is this a sign of the intellectual openness that signifies our time, or is it perhaps a bit narcissistic? Because we are accustomed from many religious ideas to see ourselves as an image of a creator. This is classical ideas in many religions. But now we are a creator if we manage to create sentient, intelligent conscience. But to me, right now, the notion doesn't even make sense. I don't even see that we have a theoretical framework that shows us that artificial awareness is even theoretically possible. And that is what these new proposals aim about. For example, if consciousness were to exist in an entity that is materially so different as a machine compared to a living organism, would it even be similar to us? How can we detect it? How can we understand it? And given that we can detect it and understand it in some measure, how can we communicate? Secondly, should we really call this new phenomenon consciousness? Should we expand the denotation of our definition of consciousness to include it? Or should we perhaps coin a new term to denote this new phenomenon? Because it would be a wholly new phenomenon. Now these questions, and here we come again, I repeat and end with my key message. These questions present us with conceptual choices that need to be made both philosophically in terms of analytical clarity, simplicity, and logical coherence, and empirically in terms of scientific justification, experimental validation, and explanatory power, but also, last but not least, normative in terms of ethical and social values. It is not purely objective how or why we conceive the presence or type of mental features such as consciousness to someone or something, and it has very powerful ethical limitations. Being denied it or depreciated as mentally inferior has led to hellish and intellectually slanted life conditions for large sections of humanity. There are objective evidence, of course, such as measurements of structures, for example, brain structure and activity, and observations of behavior. But how we choose to interpret them will always be a question of values. Our ideologies influence our theoretical choices that in turn influence our worldviews and social structures. So science and society in symbiosis will continue to shape our worldviews and our society, so we need to choose our directions very, very carefully. Depending on them, we will end up living in deeply different worlds, intellectually, morally, socially, politically, and economically. And hence the need for an open and well-informed dialogue that will also bring our ideological, motivational forces to the surface. Thank you very much for your attention.
Grazie Kathinka per questa introduzione a una serie di problematiche filosofiche che davvero meritano ulteriore approfondimento. In questa occasione noi lanciamo ovviamente degli input che poi meriterebbero ben altra analisi, però ci sarà anche tutto spazio per un po' di dibattito. Uno dei temi che ha toccato la professoressa è quello delle implicazioni etiche della ricerca sulla coscienza. E l'ambito, potremmo dire, privilegiato in cui le problematiche etiche si toccano con mano è quello della ricerca e del lavoro clinico sui pazienti, per esempio in stato comatoso, in stato vegetativo, stato minimamente cosciente. Il professore Massimini qui presente è uno delle massime autorità in questo ambito. Lui il professor Massimini insegna all'Università di Milano e collabora con alcuni tra i massimi studiosi della coscienza a livello mondiale, tra cui cito soltanto Giulio Tononi, che è il fondatore di un'altra teoria molto accreditata in ambito scientifico, ma anche Christoph Koch, per esempio, visto che hanno pubblicato qualcosa recentemente insieme. È un esperto dei meccanismi neurofisiologici che determinano la perdita e il recupero della coscienza in diverse condizioni, tra cui lo stato di veglia, sonno, sogno, anestesia, epilessia, eccetera. Oggi ci parlerà di come sia possibile elaborare una diagnosi più affidabile in pazienti appunto comatosi affetti da danno cerebrale grave. Prego allora il professor Massimini di accomodarsi, non so se è tecnico.
Grazie Michele. I will switch to English, if that's okay, because it's going to be even more practical for me, because many terms are better in English. And well, thank you, Michele. I'm honored to be here, and actually I'm very happy because I listened to talks that are really fantastic, and I hope I can somehow contribute with this more practical perspective, which will touch upon some of the problems raised by everybody, actually, for me. So. This is a different connection. I do.
Sì, vedete.
I'm sorry.
No problem. Okay, so let's get into the problem. So the problem is really a practical one. So when we assess consciousness at the bedside of patients, emergency room, intensive care, or even rehabilitation centers, we treat the brain as a black box with respect to consciousness because we are not very sure about the mechanism. It's still a mystery. And we work on input and output. So basically, we observe behavior. What we do is that we stimulate the patients in different ways, sensory inputs, clench your fist, open your eyes, and then we observe behavior. If the behavior is reproducible and specific, then we say the patient is conscious. The problem is that sometimes patients are unresponsive, but they are still conscious. And this happens simply, maybe because the motor output are blocked. The patient is fully paralyzed, and there's no way he can show his conscious through motor behavior that we can observe extrinsically. At the same time, there are situations where sensory processing is severely impaired, and thus the patient will not understand command, or maybe won't process sensory information. So it sounds a little bit extreme, but as a matter of fact, it is not just an exercise, like a philosophical or an ethical exercise, to consider brains that are disconnected from the external world, maybe temporarily because of lesions. So the fact is that intensive care medicine, with the progress made, is producing new brains. And sometimes these brains are fragmented, isolated. Sometimes you face islands of cortex, big chunks of the brain that are potentially disconnected from the external environment, both on the input side and the output side. This can happen for many reasons. Just to give an example, some patients, massive frontal injury can lead to motor executive dysfunctions. These patients would be unresponsive, akinetic, and difficult to evaluate. Other times, the lesion involves maybe the left part of the brain. The patient will not understand language, will not follow command. This is another challenge. In other cases, and I will show examples of that in a while, patients are disconnected because lesions in the brainstem, where all the wires are coming out and in from the brain, are blocking input and output. So these are brains that are difficult to access and evaluate from the extrinsic perspective of input and output. And so what do we do? Is there experience in there, any form of experience? How can we minimize error in these cases where behavior and observation, extrinsic observation, has nothing to say? So how can we evaluate these islands of awareness? It's a challenging question, and with no easy answer. The thing is, we know for sure that consciousness can be generated in brains that are disconnected. We know this from physiology and from dreaming. Every night we dream, and during dreaming, because of physiological mechanisms, we are disconnected from the input and the output side. And dreams, they have nothing to do, and they do need inputs coming from the sensory periphery, for example. And the subject is also paralyzed. So the thing is, we are producing brains that are potentially disconnected. We know that consciousness can be generated within the brain, temporarily at least, and we need to assess these patients. Thus, the challenge is to develop measures that are independent of sensory input and motor output. This is a challenge. It's not easy. There are many problems, and among the many measures, not all of them work. But the point I want to make is that we are all together making progresses. So consciousness remains a mystery. There are different theories. There is a hot debate, but all together we are moving forward. And the point of my talk is to give an idea of this positive trajectory in the science of consciousness. It's mainly an empirical trajectory. So I want to start from this paper that I find very interesting. It's a paper published more than 20 years ago. First paper that links consciousness to a specific form of complexity. It's an interesting paper because it starts not from a functional behavioral definition of consciousness, but more from a phenomenological definition. That is the observation of basic properties of consciousness. So consciousness is unitary and very rich and dynamic at the same time. So this very early paper, I would say almost pre-theoretical, just proposed that, you know, if you need to measure something in the brain, you should measure something that supports this unity and this diversity. And thus the idea is that, you know, what is important for consciousness, at least, you know, in very general terms, is the fact that neurons can interact strongly with each other, this unity part, integration part, that Jean-Pierre already mentioned, and also this dynamical differentiation. So neurons, the brain is one, but also capable of traversing through many different states, richness of repertoire of states. So this is a very general statement, and it also resonates a lot with what Jean-Pierre said before, the global neural workspace. And the good news is that if you look at the literature, so this was 20 years ago, and you look at the literature now and the empirical trajectory, you find so many empirical papers that maybe in completely independent way are sort of validating this very general idea. So we did a review recently, and there are at least 200 papers showing that measures of complexity are, for the moment, the best approximation, the measure that allow you to make the best inference of consciousness. So these measures have been applied a lot, and there's a growing exponential, you know, number of papers over the last few years, using different techniques across different situations: sleep, coma, anesthesia, epilepsy, psychedelic drugs. And in all cases, and this is very good news, these measures are following the presence or the decrease or even fading of consciousness in a way that is rather reasonable. So this is good as compared to previous situation. And there are many different approaches here. You know, this is one paper using fMRI. This is another example of a paper using fMRI to measure this balance and coexistence of unity and diversity in the brain. It's not an easy measure. There are many ways to do this. And basically, you need to assess the ability of neurons to interact, at the same time, their ability to produce many different schemes of activity. And there are different approaches. You can start from spontaneous EEG activity. You can start from neuroimaging. And you can also devise specific approaches where you stimulate the brain directly, the cerebral cortex, and check the complexity of the response, this balance between unity and diversity. And this is the approach that we use, and it's the one that I will take as an example, not because it's absolutely the best example, but because it's the one I know best, and it's quite interesting, I think. So the idea here is that in order to measure this ability of neurons to interact and produce complex patterns, you go directly on the cerebral cortex and you perturb the brain with a tool that is called transcranial magnetic stimulation. It's a non-invasive way of activating cortical neurons, and then you record the response of the overall system with electroencephalography, putting electrode sensors in the brain. And then you measure the complexity by using specific algorithms, basically zipping algorithms of these responses. And you come up with a number that is not the magic number of consciousness, it's just a quantification of the ability of neurons to interact and to produce many states. It's a measure of the multidimensionality of the brain, if you want. And the idea is that if neurons are not able to interact, you perturb the brain, response to zip complexity. So this perturbation complexity index, a number, will be low. If the brain is integrated, connected, but it's homogeneous, there are no specific properties, you can have a response that is global, but stereotypical, redundant, easy to compress with this zipping algorithm. And only if you have a brain that is made of long range and short range connections that are differentiated and functionally rich in terms of repertoire, then you're going to have high complexity. So it's a measure of approximating in a very coarse manner this physical property that seems to be important. for sustaining this basic phenomenology properties of consciousness. Thing is, does it work? Is it useful or not? So it sounds complicated because you need to stimulate the brain, and I think the duty we have is to make this a simpler measure. So we are, working to approximating this measure towards something like echography, that you can bring it to the bedside of patients. So there are many, efforts we are doing in this direction. And the way it works, or the way it looks at least for now, it's shown in this movie where you can see that there is a stimulator on top of the head of the subject. And then you have this navigation system that is pointing the stimulator to the brain. And at the same time, you're recording the response. And you get these responses online. So you imagine you are there with the patient and you measure the complexity of this internal echo produced by the brain. It speaks about the internal complexity of the circuits in health and disease. So the thing is that you need to practically test this, or at least to validate the measure. So the approach we took was a long approach, and we started by calibrating the measures in conditions where we know that subjects are conscious because they can tell us. And this included subjects who were awake, brain-injured subjects that were conscious, locked-in patients, stroke patients, and other conditions. And also subjects that were conscious but disconnected from the world. So I think this is an effort that we need to do. We need to look for consciousness even when this is not evident in behavior. So the calibration included situations like dreaming or hallucinating under ketamine. That is a form of consciousness that we want to be sensitive to. And on the other hand, we tested the counterfactual that in the blue box, situations where consciousness is at least diminished, this complexity was decreasing. So once we did this and we found that the measure was, specific and sensitive to these situations, we felt like testing it at the bedside of patients. And here how the thing looked in a real setting situation. So here you have a patient that emerged from coma. The patient is unresponsive, so there's no way you can evaluate any sign of conscious behavior. And there is the stimulator, so we're directly probing the brain using the navigation system. And then we are recording the inner workings of the brain by electroencephalography. So you see that you can do it almost on the spot. There's some work to do this, but it works quite well and quite reliably. So what do we see in patients? How can we use this kind of approach? So I'll show you some examples. So here, of course, the number we come up is one number that quantifies the complexity of the brain, and the number is calibrated in these situations where consciousness is definitely present and consciousness is reduced. And the logic is that we draw an operational cutoff. This is not the boundary between conscious and unconsciousness. It's just a line above which, even if the patient is unresponsive, if you find high values, you must take special care of this patient because you must assume that there might be somebody in there. So we don't use this number to rule out consciousness because we are not confident about the calibration, especially on the negative side. But if the patient is scoring high in complexity, even if he looks in a vegetative state or unresponsive, we need to pay attention. So this is the logic. Now, how do we know it's sensitive and it works? There is a category of patients called minimally conscious patients who are very difficult to detect. They are conscious, but difficult because they fluctuate a lot and the signs are difficult. And so the first test is how does it work in this challenging population? And it works empirically very well. So it has a very high sensitivity. So you don't miss out many of these patients, only 1 out of 10. And to give you an idea how this compares to other techniques, for example, there is a way based on fMRI to detect these patients, asking patients to imagine to do things and then reading out brain metabolism. But this is a very challenging task. And the sensitivity is very low. You miss out 9 minimally conscious patients out of 10. So when you see this, it's very informative. The patient is definitely conscious. He can understand you or she can understand you, but you miss out many, many patients. There are better ways, such as so-called event-related potentials, so stimulations that are auditory stimulation, and they require some processing, cognitive processing. One example is the P3B, and this is better in terms of sensitivity than fMRI because it requires less participation on the subject side, but still sensitivity is quite low. You see it's about 31%. It's informative about the fact that the patient can process sensory information or auditory information. So it's an important information, but again, in terms of sensitivity, it's low. If you compare and you take spontaneous EEG rhythms, just looking at the electrical activity of the brain, also you don't have a high performance because sometimes patients can be conscious but with a very bad spontaneous EEG. But by perturbing the brain, you reveal this core of complexity, even in cases where the EEG is severely abnormal. So overall, in terms of sensitivity, the first level screening, this is a good approach to be sensitive to consciousness detection. Now, let me show you just some cases. The idea, of course, is that you need to combine this with all the other measures in a hierarchical approach. But this is the first level measure where you want to be sensitive. Or if you have doubts and EEG is inconclusive, ERP is inconclusive, then you go with this one. Now, you know, what can we say about patients that are unresponsive, the real target of this? So basically, behind the label of the vegetative state, that is patients that are fully unresponsive, there are three ways, three brain states. One is that there is no response to the cortical perturbation because these are patients with post-anoxic injury, cardiac arrest, asphyxia, where basically the cortex is gone, and this is not surprising. It's not even really informative. Then there is an interesting category of patients that are vegetative state with the brain or islands of brain that are reactive and very active, but stuck in a low complexity state, similar to the brains of anesthetized and sleeping people. So these are interesting patients because, you know, we need to figure out whether they can recover complexity or what's wrong in their brain. Then there is a third category that is ethically very relevant on the spot, because these are the patients with high complexity, about 20% of the patients. In these patients, in spite of everything, in spite of a bad EEG, in spite of no behavior, in spite of unresponsiveness, we need to infer consciousness. And now I will finish by showing you three cases among many to show you, how this works and how it can be useful. So imagine that you have two patients and they are equal, they are both unresponsive, and then you try to open the black box by perturbing directly the brain and recording from the brain. And you see that the patient on the left is a high complexity patient, whereas the one on the right is a low complexity patient. Now, in the one on the left, you need to assume that there are problems with executive functions or maybe communication channels, and you need to restore that or look and dig deeper in his brain to find and demonstrate that he's conscious. One example. So this is a recent patient, came in with a massive frontal injury, completely unresponsive for weeks. And then the EEG also is bad. This is really a bad EEG, an EEG that you would say confirms vegetative state, no doubts, no problem. But then we do TMS-EEG, this technique, and we find in 2 sessions in a row, high complexity. So clearly above this operational threshold, suggesting now there is somebody there. Look, in spite of the EEG, in spite of the absent ERPs, there is something in there. And indeed, if you put the patient in a scanner that records brain metabolism, and you ask the patient to imagine to squeeze end, so you do this second level exam, in this case, you find that the patient activates the right part of the cortex. So he's paralyzed, he cannot move, but he can imagine and he can produce this cortical activation on demand, meaning that confirming together this convergence of evidence that the patient is actually somehow there. Another case, I mean, these are different cases. Sometimes it's just a matter of time. Patients are coming into the hospital and the rehabilitation, maybe after weeks or after a month, they're still completely unresponsive, but they have high complexity. And sometimes you just need to wait because they have complexity. They might be conscious, they might be about to recover, maybe they are somehow conscious, but they cannot, recover behavior. And basically, this is a prognostic marker because sooner or later they will recover in the space of weeks. So this is also important. To be sensitive to consciousness, it means also to see consciousness a little bit before behavior. And this is important because sometimes decisions are taken early and sometimes these decisions are wrong. And then finally, another case where we can also guide treatment. This is a case of a patient where the lesion is here in the midbrain. She's completely unresponsive for months and always high complexity values and young. So we try to understand, and we really struggle to understand what happens here. And then we have this evidence that there is a lesion in an area called the substantia nigra, which is an area that's projecting dopaminergic influence on the basal ganglia and the frontal cortex. And if you don't have that, if you have a lesion there, you might be in an extreme state of Parkinsonism, stuck, blocked, unable to do anything. So with the caregivers, we decide to give amantadine because we argue that there is a capacity for consciousness, but no behavioral output. And amantadine is something that replaces dopamine, basically. And after a week, the patient was able to react to stimuli. Now you want to probably hear what's happening here. But she's responding to commands. Move your fingers, move your index, and that means that she's there. No doubts, no question. But you wouldn't have known, and maybe you wouldn't have done that intervention. So this is to say that we need to make effort. We are far from perfect, and we need to combine measures, make them easier, make them accessible. But we are moving forward, and this is important not only for detecting consciousness, but and this is another story, another talk, to maybe one day promote recovery of consciousness in patients that are in low complexity state. So that's another story. This is an effort that we are actually my main interest, but I will not talk about this, but it's important because many patients are blocked in a state of low complexity, and maybe you just need to turn a key. And in some cases, they just recover. They recover this complexity, and then they recover consciousness. So can we do something about it? This is something that we are also addressing within the Human Brain Project altogether, actually, its implications at the multi-scale level. Okay, thank you so much. And actually, I want to thank all the collaborators and the widespread team that is doing this work. Thank you.